Tonight, we will tell you a story from a time when justice was often harsh, public, and profoundly personal. A story of the Middle Ages, a period spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, when society sought to maintain order through methods that might seem alien to us today. You will learn how minor transgressions could lead to profound humiliation, and how even the act of speaking out of turn could result in public shame. We will explore the philosophy behind these punishments, which aimed not just to punish, but to deter, to reform, and to remind everyone of the strict social order. You will discover the simple wooden devices that held offenders in plain sight, exposed to the elements and the judgment of their neighbors. We will describe the specialized tools designed to silence those deemed too outspoken, and the chilling rituals intended to test guilt or innocence by invoking divine will. You will hear about permanent marks etched onto flesh, and the dark, lonely confines where hope itself could fade. And finally, we will touch upon the most extreme forms of isolation, where a person could be sealed away from the world entirely, left to a slow, solitary end. Oh, and if you enjoy these stories, which transform historical facts into a journey for your imagination, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a comment. Your support helps us create new narratives for your peaceful nights. All right, find a comfortable spot, settle in, and let your mind drift back to a time when the lines between crime, sin, and social disruption were often blurred, and justice was a spectacle for all to witness. In the heart of the medieval world, the concept of punishment was deeply intertwined with belief, community, and the very fabric of society. The Middle Ages, a time of profound faith and stark realities, harbored a unique approach to justice, one that might seem harsh and alien to our modern sensibilities. To truly understand the strange and intimate punishments of this era, you must first grasp the core philosophy that underpinned them. It was not merely about retribution, but about a multifaceted restoration of order, both social and divine. In an age dominated by deeply held religious beliefs, crime was not simply a violation of man-made law. It was often considered a sin, an offense against God Himself. Therefore, the act of punishment became a ritualistic act of purification, a public declaration that balance was being restored. Imagine a world where community was paramount, where every individual's actions directly impacted the well-being of the collective. When a crime occurred, it was seen as a tear in the very fabric of this communal existence. Justice, then, was less about the rehabilitation of the offender, a concept largely undeveloped in that period, and more about repairing the visible breach in social harmony. This led directly to the emphasis on public display. Punishments were rarely carried out in secret. They were spectacles, performed in market squares, at town gates, or along busy thoroughfares, ensuring that all could witness the consequences of transgression. This public performance served multiple critical functions. Firstly, it was a powerful tool of deterrence. By making the suffering of the offender overtly visible and often humiliating, the authorities sought to instill fear and obedience in the wider populace. The sight of a wrongdoer in the stocks, their face contorted in shame, or a thief missing a hand, was a stark, living warning. It communicated in no uncertain terms the precise boundaries of acceptable behavior and the severe repercussions of crossing them. For many, who might never learn to read or write, These public displays were the most effective form of legal education, etching the lesson into their minds through direct, unforgettable experience. The cold stone of the pillory, the biting wind on an exposed face, the jeers of the crowd, these were sensory deterrents designed to ensure that no one would lightly consider a similar path. The intention was to create a society where the mere thought of such public disgrace or pain would be enough to prevent most from committing even minor offenses. Secondly, public punishment served as a means of social shaming and ostracization, an integral part of the justice system. For medieval society, honor and reputation were highly valued, and their loss could be as devastating as physical pain, if not more so. To be publicly humiliated was to be stripped of one's standing, to become an outcast in the very community one relied upon for survival and identity. The community itself often participated in this shaming, hurling insults, rotten food, or even stones at the offender. This active participation reinforced the collective disapproval of the crime and solidified the community's moral boundaries. It was a shared experience that reaffirmed social norms and collective values, ensuring that the entire population understood and upheld the established order. The very act of watching, of participating, bonded the community against the perceived threat of lawlessness. Thirdly, and perhaps most profoundly, was the spiritual dimension. As mentioned, crime was often equated with sin. Therefore, the suffering inflicted through punishment was sometimes viewed as a form of penance, a painful atonement that could cleanse the individual's soul and restore their standing in the eyes of God. It was believed that through visible suffering, the offender might find grace, and that the public display of their torment could even serve as a communal prayer for their redemption. This belief system allowed for the seemingly contradictory blend of extreme physical cruelty and a deep underlying spiritual purpose. The pain was not just physical, it was meant to be a crucible for the soul, a pathway to purification. This understanding permeated all levels of society, from the highest clergy to the lowest peasant, shaping their perceptions of justice and morality. The belief was that the more visible and intense the suffering, the more complete the atonement, and the more fully the balance, both earthly and divine, could be restored. This philosophy explains why many medieval punishments were designed not just to inflict pain, but to be deeply personal and symbolic. They often targeted specific body parts related to the crime, a hand for theft, a tongue for slander, or aimed to strip away the offender's dignity in a manner directly relevant to their transgression. The punishments were often intimate, engaging with the body and senses in ways that modern justice systems rarely do. They were not abstract legal concepts. They were lived experiences designed to impact the individual and the community directly and forcefully. They were a vivid, tangible manifestation of the law etched into the public consciousness through sight, sound, and sometimes even smell. This directness, this absence of mediation, was a defining characteristic of medieval justice, making it profoundly different from the complex legal frameworks we navigate today. The goal was immediate, undeniable impact, both on the wrongdoer and on every soul who witnessed their plight. It was a system built on visibility, shared understanding, and a resolute belief in the power of public shame and suffering to maintain order in a world far less structured and far more dangerous than our own. When we speak of medieval justice, the mind often conjures images of grand castles and dark dungeons, but the most common forms of punishment were far more public, designed to be seen, felt, and remembered by the entire community. These were not always about inflicting grievous bodily harm, but about breaking the spirit through shame and ridicule, about making a person an open book for all to read. The underlying belief was that a visible punishment not only warned others, but also, in a strange communal way, purified the social body, restoring balance by publicly marking the transgression. Among the most prevalent and recognizable of these instruments of public humiliation were the stocks and the pillory, twin devices that served as a stark, visible lesson, often erected in the very heart of daily life. Imagine, if you will, the bustling heart of a medieval town, the market square, alive with the sounds of vendors hawking their wares, the chatter of merchants haggling, the playful cries of children. In the very center of this vibrant scene often stood a low, sturdy wooden structure, simple yet ominous in its purpose. This was the stocks. It consisted of two heavy, rough-hewn timber boards, horizontally aligned, with semicircular cutouts along their length. When an offender was brought forward, their ankles, and sometimes their wrists, would be inserted into these cutouts. The upper board, often gritty with the dust of the square and the grime of previous occupants, would then be lowered and locked into place, securing them with an unyielding finality. The individual would be forced into an uncomfortable seated or crouched position, unable to stand, unable to move much, their feet trapped, their hands sometimes bound as well. The cold, unyielding wood pressed against their skin, a constant reminder of their captivity. The stocks were typically reserved for minor offenses, transgressions that disrupted the social order more than they threatened life or property. Drunkenness, petty brawls, vagrancy, or the use of offensive language were common reasons for a stint in the stocks. The punishment was not primarily about inflicting sharp physical pain, though the forced, unnatural posture could become excruciating over hours. It was about relentless exposure and the slow, grinding erosion of dignity. The individual was left utterly vulnerable to the elements, the biting cold of winter winds that could numb fingers and toes, the relentless, scorching sun of summer that beat down on an unprotected head, or the chilling, soaking dampness of rain that seeped into clothes and bones. They were also exposed to the full, unblinking gaze of their neighbors, their friends, even their own family members. The very people they lived among, traded with, and shared their lives with, now saw them in a state of utter degradation, their vulnerability laid bare for all to witness. The humiliation was profound, a public stripping away of self-respect. You could not hide your face. You could not turn away from the accusing stares, the knowing glances, the outright mockery. Your identity as a respected member of the community was stripped bare, replaced by the stark, inescapable label of offender. Passers-by, emboldened by anonymity, the collective mood of the crowd, or a sense of righteous indignation, might jeer, shout insults, or even throw various projectiles. Rotten vegetables, squishy fruit, clumps of mud, or even animal dung could rain down upon the trapped individual, splattering their clothes and face, their hair becoming matted and foul. The familiar sounds of the market, usually a comforting backdrop to daily life, would now be distorted into a cacophony of derision and scorn. The smells, usually of fresh bread, spices, or livestock, would now be tainted by the acrid stench of thrown refuse, the raw odor of the crowd's contempt, and perhaps the faint metallic tang of fear. Every minute stretched into an eternity, marked by the slow crawl of the sun across the sky, the endless procession of changing faces, and the growing ache in your joints, tendons, and muscles. You were there, physically present, but you were no longer truly part of the community. You were an object lesson, an outcast, if only for a day. Closely related to the stocks, yet designed for a slightly different emphasis, and often for more serious offenses involving public trust, was the pillory. Often standing taller than the stocks, sometimes on a raised platform to ensure maximum visibility, the pillory held the offender in a standing position. It consisted of an upright post with a movable board at chest height, featuring 3 holes, one larger central hole for the head and 2 smaller ones on either side for the hands. When locked in place, the individual's neck and wrists were secured, forcing them to remain upright, their arms extended outwards, their head thrust forward. The key difference was the elevation and the specific immobilization of the head, ensuring that the individual's face was fully visible to all, a deliberate design choice to maximize the public's direct interaction with the culprit. The pillory was generally used for offenses that involved deception, fraud, or public falsehood. Those who engaged in fraudulent business practices, used false weights and measures in the market, committed perjury in court, spread malicious slander, or engaged in other forms of public deceit were prime candidates for the pillory. The idea was to make the face of the liar, the cheat, or the slanderer utterly undeniable, forcing them to confront the direct judgment of the very people they had wronged or misled, often with their instruments of crime, such as false scales, hung around their neck. The physical discomfort in the pillory was often more acute than in the stocks. Your neck would ache from being held rigidly upright. Your arms would grow numb from the constant, unnatural extension, a dull, throbbing pain spreading from your shoulders down to your fingertips. You could not shift your weight, could not rub the growing pins and needles in your limbs, could not escape the direct force of the sun or rain on your exposed head. But more than the physical discomfort, it was the relentless, direct, and inescapable gaze of the crowd that was the true torment. There was no reprieve, no moment of privacy. Every jeer, every thrown object, every mocking laugh landed not just on your body, but directly on your sense of self, on your public persona, scarring it perhaps forever. The very air around you seemed to vibrate with disapproval, a palpable wave of collective condemnation. The public, in these moments, became an active, often merciless participant in the justice system. They were not merely passive observers. They were the enforcers of shame, the living embodiment of society's condemnation. This communal aspect was absolutely crucial to the medieval understanding of justice. It was believed that by subjecting an individual to such profound public disgrace, not only would that person be deterred from future wrongdoing, but the entire community would be reminded of the consequences of straying from accepted norms. It was a visceral, unforgettable lesson, etched into the collective memory by the side of a neighbor a friend or a stranger trapped and shamed in the town square. The duration of these punishments, typically a few hours, but sometimes extending for a full day or even across multiple days, ensured that the discomfort and humiliation were cumulative, pressing down on the individual's spirit, the stocks, and the pill. From the more general public shaming of the stocks and pillory, which immobilized an offender and left them exposed to the elements and the scorn of passers-by, we turn now to a device designed for a more specific and often more intimately targeted transgression, the scold's bridle. This instrument, also known by its older name, a brank, was a particularly insidious form of punishment, primarily aimed at women accused of excessive talking, gossiping, or being generally unruly in their speech. It was a chilling tool of social control, meticulously crafted to ensure that public order, as defined by the rigid moral and social codes of the time, remained undisturbed by what was deemed inappropriate verbal expression. The very existence of such a device speaks volumes about the value placed on silence and conformity, particularly within the domestic and public spheres of medieval life, where a woman's voice was often expected to be modest and restrained. The scold's bridle itself was typically a stark, unadorned metal framework, often crafted from cold, unforgiving iron. It was designed to fit over the head like a cage or a muzzle, encompassing the entire face, and sometimes even extending down to the neck. This grim apparatus was usually secured at the back with a heavy lock or a sturdy buckle, ensuring that once it was in place, it could not be easily removed by the wearer, adding to the feeling of absolute helplessness. The sight of it alone, even before it was worn, would have instilled a profound sense of dread in anyone. But the true ingenuity and inherent cruelty of the bridle lay in its most distinctive and painful feature, a small sharp plate or a pointed spike that extended downwards into the mouth. This metallic intrusion would either press firmly and relentlessly against the tongue, making any attempt at speech utterly impossible, or, in some of the more severe and unforgiving designs, it would actually enter the mouth and rest directly on top of, or even more brutally, under the tongue. Any desperate attempt to speak, to form a word, or even to move the tongue in a natural way would result in immediate, searing pain, a bitter, metallic taste of dread, and the profound risk of injury, tearing, or bleeding. The sensation for the wearer would be one of constant oppressive pressure, a suffocating inability to articulate a single sound, transforming the mouth into a prison of silence, an internal torment. Imagine, if you will, being forced to wear such a device, the rough, cold metal pressing uncomfortably against your skin, the weight of the iron frame a constant throbbing burden on your head, perhaps causing a dull ache behind your eyes, your voice, your most fundamental means of expression, completely and brutally silenced. You could see the faces of the curious crowd, hear their jeers and whispers, feel the biting wind or the harsh sun on your exposed skin, smell the dust and the unwashed bodies of those who came to stare, but you could not respond. You could not explain your innocence. You could not plead for mercy. You could not utter a single word in your own defense. It was a punishment that stripped away not just your freedom of movement, confining your head within its metallic grasp, but your very essence, reducing you to a silent, visible spectacle, an object lesson for all to see. The individuals subjected to the brink would then often be subjected to further public humiliation. They would be paraded through the narrow, often muddy streets of the town or village, sometimes led by a solemn official, or in other instances, even chained to a prominent public pillar, a market cross, or the very stocks themselves. The rhythmic, grating clanking of the metal as they moved, or the stark stillness of their enforced silence, combined with the unusual and terrifying sight of the bridle itself, would inevitably draw the attention of every passerby, stopping them in their tracks. People would halt their daily routines, point with accusatory fingers, whisper behind cupped hands, and openly mock the silent, suffering figure. The shame was not just a fleeting emotion, it was palpable, a heavy, suffocating cloak draped over the wearer, amplifying their silent agony and branding them indelibly in the eyes of the community. This elaborate and intimate public display served multiple, deeply ingrained purposes within the rigid framework of medieval justice and societal control. For the governing authorities, whether they were local magistrates, town councils, or even ecclesiastical courts, it was a clear and unmistakable demonstration of their absolute power and their determination to maintain order. It served as a stark, visual reminder to everyone else of the immediate and severe consequences of transgressing established social norms, particularly those related to acceptable speech and orderly conduct. It was a warning etched not in stone, but in the collective memory of those who witnessed it. For the wider community, it reinforced the prevailing, often patriarchal attitudes about acceptable behavior, especially for women. The silence imposed by the bridle was not just a physical restraint, it was deeply symbolic, a brutal metaphor for the suppression of female agency and voice, a clear statement of who held power. It conveyed the chilling message that certain voices were not welcome, that certain opinions were not to be expressed, and that any words deemed disruptive to the peace and hierarchy of the community would be met with swift and painful retribution. The very act of wearing the bridle marked the individual as a public nuisance, a scold, whose words were considered dangerous and whose very presence was seen as a threat to communal harmony and the established social fabric. The duration of this harrowing punishment varied considerably. It could be for a few hours, a single, agonizing day under the public gaze, or an entire week, or even longer, depending on the perceived severity of the offense, the mood of the magistrate, and the specific customs of the locality. Regardless of the exact time endured, the experience would be indelibly etched into the memory of the wearer, a constant nagging reminder of their profound humiliation and the overwhelming, inescapable power of the community to enforce its will. The scold's bridle was not merely a device to inflict physical discomfort, though it certainly did that with cold efficiency. It was designed above all to break the spirit, to instill a lasting, crippling fear of public censure, and to ensure absolute and unquestioning future conformity. The cold, unyielding metal against the tender skin of the face and mouth, the constant inability to swallow comfortably, the aching, bruised sensation of the tongue, the desperate thirst that could not be quenched, the sheer exhaustion from the weight and the shame, all contributed to an experience of profound physical discomfort and utter, soul-crushing powerlessness. It was a silent scream, a desperate plea unheard by anyone but the wearer, a haunting testament to the intricate and often brutal methods of social regulation in the Middle Ages, where the control of the tongue was seen as paramount to the control of the soul, and public shame was deemed a powerful deterrent. Beyond the silent shame of the scold's bridle, another form of public humiliation awaited those deemed to have disturbed the peace with their tongues, or more gravely, their perceived dark arts. This was the ducking stool, an instrument whose very name evokes its chilling purpose and the deep-seated fears it sought to address. Imagine, if you will, a robust, often crudely fashioned chair. Beyond the physical discomfort and the shock of cold water, the medieval mind often sought to punish through the very act of seeing and being seen, turning the offender into a living, breathing spectacle of their own transgression. This deep-seated desire for visual condemnation, for a punishment that imprinted itself not just on the body, but on the collective memory of the community, led to the invention of instruments far more intimate than the fixed stocks or the ducking stool. These devices clung directly to the body, transforming the individual into a walking, undeniable symbol of their shame. These were the shame masks and the cloaks of infamy, tools of justice designed to publicly brand and isolate. Imagine for a moment a world where your face, your very identity, could be twisted and distorted into a grotesque caricature of your misdeed. The shame mask, sometimes known as a Schandmaske in German-speaking lands, was precisely that. Crafted with rudimentary but effective skill from iron or tin, these masks were not merely uncomfortable or stifling. They were designed with a chilling artistry to be visually striking, often depicting animals or exaggerated human features that directly mocked the wearer's specific fault. The symbolism was rarely subtle, ensuring instant recognition of the offense. If you were accused of gossiping, of spreading malicious rumors that tore at the fabric of communal trust, you might be forced to wear a mask with a grotesquely long, flapping tongue, or perhaps even the head of a pig, symbolizing gluttony not of food, but of words. A person convicted of gluttony in the literal sense, of excessive eating or drinking, might find themselves encased in a mask shaped like a pig's head or a wolf's maw, their own human face hidden behind a symbol of their unbridled excess. For those who were considered quarrelsome, prone to public brawls or domestic disputes, a mask resembling a snarling dog, its teeth bared in perpetual aggression, might be chosen. The sheer weight of these metal creations, often heavy and poorly balanced, pressing down on the head, would have been oppressive, causing constant strain on the neck and shoulders. The limited vision through small, often crudely cut eye holes would have disoriented the wearer, making their public parade through the bustling, unforgiving streets of a medieval town even more miserable and precarious. Yet, the immediate physical discomfort, though considerable, was always secondary to the profound psychological burden. Every single glance from a passer-by, every whispered comment, every pointing finger, every jeering laugh from a child who understood the symbol, each became a fresh, stinging wound, reminding the wearer, and indeed all who saw them, of their public fall from grace and the indelible mark it left. This was a punishment that continued to unfold with every step and every interaction, long after the initial donning of the mask. These masks were not typically reserved for serious, violent felonies that demanded a more severe response. Instead, they were most often applied for minor infractions that, while seemingly small, deeply disturbed the delicate social order and moral fabric of the community. A public argument that escalated into a disturbance, a repeated act of lying that eroded trust, or even an act of petty theft that indicated a lack of honesty. The primary intent behind their use was not to inflict lasting physical harm or to permanently incapacitate, but to ensure that the punishment was immediate, undeniable, and impossible for anyone to ignore. The offender, stripped of their individual identity, their human features concealed and transformed into a monstrous or comical figure, would then be paraded through the town square or perhaps forced to stand in a prominent, often crowded location for hours, sometimes even for days on end. The very act of walking, of moving through the public space with such a mask, would instantly draw every eye, every judgment, every derisive comment, turning the busy streets into a humiliating, inescapable stage for their transgression. It was a performance of shame enacted for the entire community, a stark lesson etched into the collective consciousness. Beyond the masks, certain specialized garments were also employed to visually brand an offender, ensuring their public notoriety. These were the cloaks of shame, or Schandmantel, a German term that evokes the very essence of dishonor. These were often large, cumbersome, and brightly colored, sometimes intentionally made from coarse, itchy fabrics like rough wool or sackcloth to add to the discomfort. They were designed to be impossible to overlook, often in garish yellows, stark, contrasting reds, or even a combination of clashing patterns, making the wearer stand out starkly against the subdued, earthy clothing of the common folk. To further ensure visibility and audibility, these cloaks were sometimes adorned with bells or other noisy attachments, ensuring that the wearer was not only seen but heard approaching from a considerable distance, drawing attention even before they were fully in sight. Imagine the constant irritating jingle of bells with every movement, a perpetual announcement of your disgrace, a sound that would echo in the wearer's mind long after the bells ceased their ringing. Sometimes the cloaks were emblazoned with large, unmistakable symbols directly related to the crime. A crudely drawn fish for a poacher caught stealing from communal waters, a distorted loaf of bread for a baker who had cheated his customers by selling short weights, or even a simple bold letter L for a persistent liar. These garments, much like the masks, served as a portable pillory, extending the period of public exposure beyond the confines of a fixed location. The wearer could not simply remove the cloak and disappear into the crowd. It was a constant, visible, and tactile reminder of their transgression, a badge of dishonor that followed them through the streets, into their homes, and even into their most private moments, as the memory of the public gaze would linger, a phantom weight upon their shoulders. The rough texture against the skin, the oppressive weight, the unceasing jingle of bells, the feeling of being perpetually exposed and judged. These sensory details compounded the profound psychological torment, creating a constant, inescapable awareness of their degraded status. The shame was not merely witnessed, it was felt, absorbed, and then reflected back by the community. The shame mask and the cloak of infamy, whether used together or separately, stripped individuals of their anonymity, their dignity, and their sense of self-worth. They were designed not just to punish through temporary physical discomfort, but to utterly dehumanize, reducing a person to the sum of their worst act, their transgression made manifest for all to see. The very sight of someone in such an outfit served as a powerful, visceral deterrent to others, a living, breathing example of what could happen if one strayed from the narrow, often rigid path of medieval righteousness and communal expectation. It was a punishment that aimed directly at the heart of human identity, twisting it into something unrecognizable, something that would forever bear the indelible mark of public scorn, long after the physical device was removed and the bells fell silent, while the stocks and pillory offered temporary shame, and the scold's bridle a brief, if painful, silencing. Medieval justice often sought to inflict a more lasting mark upon offenders. This brings us to the grim practices of branding and mutilation, punishments designed not only to inflict immediate pain, but to permanently label an individual, marking them as an outcast for the remainder of their days, forever bearing the physical proof of their transgression and serving as a living, breathing warning to all who beheld them. Branding involved the application of a heated iron to the skin, leaving an indelible scar. This was not a random act of cruelty, but a calculated and often ritualized procedure carried out with a cold, deliberate precision. The symbols burned onto the flesh were typically specific, serving as a direct visual identifier of the crime committed. A T might signify a thief, clearly marking anyone who bore it as untrustworthy in the eyes of society, making it difficult for them to find honest work or acceptance. A F could denote a forger, whose deceitful nature was now literally seared into their skin, a constant burning reminder of their dishonesty. Sometimes a more abstract mark, such as a cross or a fleur-de-lis, might be used to indicate a general malefactor or someone who had offended against the church, a sacrilegious act now publicly declared upon their very body. This public act was a stark and brutal warning to all who witnessed it and to any who would later encounter the branded individual. Imagine the scene. The crowd gathered, held in a tense silence, the solemnity of the moment broken only by the horrific hiss and sizzle of the hot metal against flesh, the acrid, sickening smell of burning skin filling the crisp medieval air, and the involuntary guttural cry of the condemned. This was a visceral sensory experience designed to be etched into the memory, not just for the victim, but for every observer present. The pain was immediate and excruciating, a searing agony that left a raw, open wound, often prone to infection in an age without sterile practices. But the true intent extended far beyond the physical sensation. This was about identification and permanent social exclusion. Wherever the branded person went, their crime was visible, an inescapable mark that served as a constant, humiliating reminder to themselves of their past misdeed and to everyone they encountered of their untrustworthy nature. It ensured that society could easily identify those who had broken its laws, preventing them from blending back into the populace unnoticed, and theoretically deterring them from committing further offenses, as their past would always precede them, a silent accusation. It was a physical manifestation of guilt, worn as a lifelong badge of dishonor, a visible testament to their fall from grace within the community. The branding iron was a tool not just of punishment, but of profound social engineering, creating a permanent underclass of the marked, reinforcing the rigid boundaries of acceptable behavior, and instilling a deep-seated fear of transgression. Mutilation took this concept a horrifying step further, involving the permanent removal of a body part. This was often reserved for more serious offenses, or for repeat offenders who had proven themselves beyond the reach of lesser deterrents, demonstrating a pattern of criminal behavior that required a more extreme physical intervention. The logic behind these gruesome acts was often rooted in the idea of poetic justice, or lex talionis, the law of retaliation, a principle of an eye for an eye. Consider the thief who might lose a hand, thus theoretically preventing them from stealing again and symbolizing the severance of their ability to commit that specific crime. The loss of the offending limb was seen as a direct, tangible consequence of its misuse, a divine retribution made manifest. Or imagine the perjurer who might lose an ear, symbolizing their inability to hear the truth, or perhaps signifying the untrustworthiness of their words, making them literally marked as a liar whose testimony could never again be trusted. For those who engaged in seditious speech or blasphemy, crimes against the state or the church, the tongue might be partially severed or the lips branded, a chilling reminder of the immense power of words and the severe penalties for their misuse in a society where order was paramount. These acts were brutal, irreversible, and profoundly dehumanizing, stripping individuals not only of their physical integrity, but also of their place in society. The loss of a hand, an ear, an eye, or even a nose was not merely a physical impairment, it was a profound declaration of social exile and a constant source of agony and daily challenge for the victim, making even the simplest tasks incredibly difficult. The stump of a missing limb or the disfigured face served as a constant living monument to the severity of medieval justice, a permanent and inescapable reminder of their crime, visible to every stranger they met, ensuring a life of hardship and judgment. Such punishments were deeply rooted in the medieval belief that the offending limb, or the part of the body associated with the crime, should be the one to suffer the most direct and visible consequence. It was a literal interpretation of making the punishment fit the crime, a stark, visceral deterrent not only to the individual, but to the entire community, demonstrating the absolute power of authority. For those who witnessed such an act, the sight of blood, the raw exposed flesh, the sound of the victim's agony, and the permanent disfigurement served as a chilling, unforgettable reminder of the absolute and unforgiving consequences of straying from the established order. The intent was clear: to instill fear, to enforce conformity, and to brand the memory of justice not only onto the body of the guilty, but into the minds of all who observed. These were not merely acts of retribution, they were carefully orchestrated spectacles of power, designed to reinforce the authority of the ruling class in the church, ensuring that obedience was maintained through the visible and terrifying threat of severe physical consequence. The scars left by branding and mutilation were not just on the skin, they were etched into the collective consciousness of the medieval world, a silent, enduring testament to an era where justice often meant the deliberate destruction of the human form to uphold societal norms and maintain a fragile social balance. The long-term effects on the victims were profound, often leading to a life of begging, isolation, or continued persecution, as their very bodies screamed of their past transgressions, making a return to a normal life virtually impossible. Their very existence became a living lesson, a cautionary tale for all, a testament to the harsh realities of medieval law, ensuring that the visual horror of their punishment served as a constant silent sermon on the wages of sin and crime within a society deeply concerned with both earthly order and spiritual salvation. These were truly intimate punishments, reaching into the very core of a person's being, altering them forever, inside and out. While branding and mutilation left an indelible mark upon the body, a constant silent accusation, another form of punishment inflicted pain that was acute and immediate, yet could, in time, fade from sight, though never from memory. This was the lash, or flogging, a punishment so common across the medieval landscape that its crack and whistle became a familiar sound in market squares and town centers. Its purpose was straightforward and effective: to inflict intense physical suffering, to deter the offender, and to serve as a stark, clear warning to all who witnessed it. For authorities, public whipping was a clear declaration of power, a tangible demonstration of swift consequences for defying law or order. It was a spectacle designed not just to punish, but to educate, to instill fear, and to reinforce rigid behavioral boundaries within the community. It was a lesson etched in pain, visible to all. Imagine the medieval mind, deeply steeped in faith, often sought not human judgment, but divine intervention, especially when faced with conflicting testimonies or the absence of clear, reliable evidence. This profound societal reliance on the spiritual led to the widespread practice of trial by ordeal, a system built on the conviction that God would directly reveal the truth, protecting the innocent and exposing the guilty. It was profoundly believed that a just and omniscient God would not allow an innocent person to suffer unjustly or permit a deceiver to escape his righteous wrath. These rigorous trials were not punishments themselves. They were harrowing methods of determining guilt, and only if found guilty would a separate, often severe punishment then follow. The very essence of the ordeal lay in its absolute reliance on the supernatural, a test where the accused's ultimate fate was placed entirely in the hands of God. One of the most common and truly terrifying forms was the ordeal by hot iron. The accused, often a man, would be required to carry a piece of glowing hot iron, sometimes weighing a pound or more, for a set distance, typically 9 paces across a consecrated floor. Imagine the sheer, overwhelming terror, the searing heat radiating from the incandescent metal, the immediate, sickening smell of burning flesh, the agonizing pain that would instantly course through the entire arm and hand. After the ordeal, the hand was immediately bound. You have heard of the stocks and the pillory, of the scold's bridle and the ducking stool, punishments designed to humiliate and to deter through public spectacle. You have learned of the branding iron and the whip, tools that etched guilt onto the very flesh or flayed it from the bone, a swift, brutal lesson for all to see. But the medieval world harbored a form of suffering far more insidious, one that did not rely on public gaze or immediate pain, but on a slow, deliberate dismantling of the human spirit, a punishment meted out in the deep, forgotten places of the earth. This was the torment of confinement and isolation, a living burial within the dark, truly cold heart of the castle itself. Imagine, if you can, the descent into such a place. It was not merely a room, but often a tomb. These were not the relatively clean, purpose-built cells of later centuries, but often crude subterranean chambers, sometimes little more than pits or disused storerooms converted for human containment. Picture the narrow winding staircases, the heavy creaking doors secured by massive iron bolts, each clang echoing with a chilling finality. As you stepped inside, the first sensation would be the overwhelming absolute darkness. No window, no crack of light from the world above, only an impenetrable blackness that pressed in from all sides, blinding you, disorienting you, making every step uncertain. Your eyes, straining, would find no form, no shape, no comforting outline. It was a darkness so profound it felt as though it had a physical weight, pressing down on you. Then would come the cold, a damp, bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep not just into your clothes, but directly into your marrow, a cold that promised never to leave. The rough-hewn stone walls, often slick with perpetual condensation, felt like the skin of a monstrous, unfeeling beast. The air itself was thick, heavy, laden with the stench of stagnant water, of mold and mildew, and, most disturbingly, of human waste. For there were no proper latrines in these forgotten spaces. Prisoners were often left to relieve themselves where they lay or stood, turning the floor into a mire of filth that attracted swarms of vermin, rats, mice, and crawling insects, which became your only companions, their scurrying movements and gnawing sounds, the sole interruptions to an otherwise terrifying silence. The very air you breathed was putrid, a constant reminder of your degrading circumstances. For a person condemned to this existence, the physical decay was relentless and agonizing. Food, when it arrived, was a meager, barely edible ration, perhaps a chunk of stale bread, infested with weevils, and a cup of brackish, often contaminated water. This starvation diet led inevitably to severe malnutrition, weakening the body, dulling the senses, and making every movement an effort. Diseases like scurvy, caused by a lack of fresh produce, would manifest in bleeding gums, loosening teeth, and painful joints. Dysentery, spread by the unsanitary conditions, would rack the body with cramps and debilitating weakness. Small cuts and abrasions, uncleaned and exposed to the filth, quickly festered, turning into weeping sores that could lead to life-threatening infections and gangrene. The constant dampness and lack of movement brought on rheumatism and severe joint pain, leaving limbs stiff and aching. Muscles, unused in the cramped, confined space, would rapidly atrophy, reducing a once strong person to a skeletal, fragile shadow of their former self. The cold brought on persistent shivers and hypothermia, slowly draining the body of its warmth and vitality. Every day was a step closer to complete physical collapse, a cruel irony where the very act of living became a prolonged form of dying. But the physical torment, though horrific, was often overshadowed by the psychological disintegration. In that absolute darkness, with no sun to mark the passage of time, no window to offer a glimpse of the outside world, the very concept of day and night vanished. Time itself became a fluid, shapeless entity, stretching out into an unbearable eternity. Hours bled into days, days into weeks, weeks into months, without distinction, without end. The profound sensory deprivation began to warp the mind. Without external stimuli, the brain started to create its own reality. distant, muffled sounds. A guard's boot on the flagstones above, the faint echo of a bell from a distant village, the groan of the castle itself would take on distorted, sinister meanings. The silence, when it was truly absolute, was even worse, a suffocating void that amplified every internal thought, every regret, every fear. Solitude, once a fleeting comfort, transformed into an unbearable weight. The prisoner, utterly alone, began to lose their sense of self. Identity blurred. Without interaction, without a reflection, without the familiar markers of a shared world, who were they? Hallucinations became common, a desperate attempt by the mind to fill the void. Faces might appear in the darkness, voices might whisper from the shadows, some comforting, some terrifying, all unreal. The line between reality and delusion blurred, leading to a slow, agonizing descent into madness, where one's own thoughts became the greatest torturer. Hope, the flickering flame that sustains life, would slowly be extinguished, replaced by a profound, crushing despair. The absolute certainty of being forgotten, of being left to rot in the dark, was a torment designed to break the spirit more thoroughly than any physical blow. This terrible form of punishment was employed for various reasons. Sometimes it was a prelude to a more public execution, designed to soften the prisoner, to break their will and make them compliant before their final moments. More often, it was a means to extract confessions, to wear down even the most resolute individual until they would admit to any crime, real or imagined, simply for the promise of an end to the torment. For political prisoners, inconvenient heirs, or those deemed dangerous to the ruling power, confinement offered a convenient and discreet way to remove them from society, without the public spectacle of a trial or execution, allowing them to simply disappear, their existence erased from public memory. It was a chillingly effective method of control, not by displaying power, but by making an individual cease to exist, not just physically, but spiritually and mentally, to erase their very identity in the suffocating embrace of darkness and silence. The absence of everything, the removal of all that defined a human being, could indeed be the most terrible punishment of all, a slow, agonizing process of erasure that left behind only a broken shell. Even beyond the deep, cold despair of the dungeon, there existed a punishment so utterly final, so profoundly intimate in its horror, that it was reserved for crimes deemed to violate the very fabric of existence, or for those whose presence was considered an absolute blight upon the world. This was the practice known as immurement. It was not common. Indeed, its very rarity amplified its terror, making it a whispered legend rather than a frequent occurrence. You would not find this punishment administered in every town square, nor would it be a standard sentence from a local lord. Instead, immurement was typically reserved for the most grievous of offenses: treason against a king, profound sacrilege against the church, or for those who had broken the most sacred of vows, such as a nun who had violated her chastity. For these transgressions, the offender was not merely to be executed. They were to be erased, their very existence sealed away from the light of day and the memory of man. This was a form of living burial, a deliberate act of entombment designed to remove an individual from the world without the swift finality of the gallows or the blade. It was a punishment that consumed you entirely, body and soul, leaving no trace but a sealed wall. Imagine if you can, the scene. The condemned individual, often weakened by prior imprisonment or the crushing weight of their sentence, would be led to a specific chamber. This would not be a public square, bustling with life and noise. Instead, it might be a forgotten cell deep within a castle's darkest keep, a windowless room in a remote tower, or a hidden recess within the ancient walls of a monastery, a place already imbued with a chilling sense of ancient silence and isolation. There would be no public crowd, no jeering onlookers, no final sermon delivered before the masses. The process of immurement was intensely private, a quiet horror unfolding away from the gaze of the world, witnessed only by those tasked with performing the grim duty. You would stand there, perhaps in a small damp room, the air thick and heavy with the scent of old stone, earth, and the faint metallic tang of fear. A single doorway, or perhaps a narrow archway that once led to another part of the structure, would be the only opening, the last connection to the world you knew. And then masons would begin their work. They would not be hurried, for haste was unnecessary. Methodically, brick by brick, layer by layer of mortar, they would begin the deliberate process of sealing the opening. You would watch, helpless, as the light slowly diminished, as the rectangle of sky and the last sliver of the outside world, perhaps a glimpse of a gray cloud or distant tree, shrank before your very eyes. Each block of stone placed, each precise trowel of mortar spread, would represent a deliberate, irreversible step towards your complete and utter isolation. The sounds of the outside world, once distant and muffled, would gradually fade into nothingness. The rustle of leaves in a faint breeze, the distant cry of a bird, the faint echo of human voices carrying on the wind. Soon, there would only be the rhythmic scrape of the trowel against stone, the dull thud of bricks being set into place, and the growing oppressive sound of your own frantic breathing, growing increasingly loud and ragged in the shrinking space. The air itself would become heavy, stale, and difficult to draw into your lungs, thick with the dust of the mortar and the confined breath of despair, a suffocating blanket pressing down upon you. And then, with the placement of the final stone and the last smear of mortar, a profound, absolute darkness would descend. This was not the darkness of a moonless night or the temporary dark of a closed room from which you might eventually emerge. This was a suffocating, impenetrable blackness, a final curtain drawn across your existence. You would be utterly alone, sealed within a tomb of your own making, or rather, one meticulously crafted for you by the hands of others. The silence would be equally absolute, a crushing void broken only by the frantic, echoing beat of your own heart, the relentless rush of blood in your ears, and perhaps the faint, chilling drip of water from the ancient, unfeeling stone, marking the slow, agonizing passage of time. There would be no escape, no possibility of rescue, no final word spoken to loved ones, for your voice would be swallowed by the stone before it could reach anyone. Your world would shrink to the cold, rough surfaces of the stone walls, pressing in around you, a space perhaps barely larger than your own body, a living coffin with no room left for hope. The horror of immurement was not simply the promise of death, but the chilling certainty of a slow, agonizing demise, prolonged by the very act of sealing you away. You would endure the slow, torturous onset of thirst, your throat growing parched and raw, your body craving moisture with an intensity that bordered on madness. Then would come the gnawing pangs of hunger, each day a new layer of torment added to the unbearable psychological burden. The air would grow staler, heavier, and more difficult to breathe with each passing hour, until every breath became a conscious, desperate effort. Your physical strength would wane, your limbs growing weak, your body slowly succumbing to the lack of sustenance and the crushing weight of confinement. Your mind, too, would struggle against the profound isolation, battling the encroaching despair, the terrifying hallucinations born of thirst and fear, and the relentless, merciless march of time in a world without light or sound. You would be left to face your end in complete and utter solitude, your cries unheard, your struggles unseen, your very existence forgotten by the world outside your stone prison. It was a punishment designed not just to inflict physical death, but to ensure the complete eradication of identity, a total and irreversible severance from the human community. You would become less than a memory, a forgotten silence within a wall, a nameless presence entombed forever. The very thought of it was enough to strike terror into the hardest heart, a chilling reminder that some punishment sought not only to end a life, but to erase it entirely, leaving behind only the cold, unyielding stone, a silent monument to a forgotten transgression. This was the ultimate intimate form of medieval justice, of final, suffocating silence,